I'd like to introduce Tom O'Neill. Tom is going to be speaking on security, fear, uncertainty and doubt. But some of you may or may not know that Tom is also a member of the IRMA committee, where he's responsible for, amongst other things, inclusion, early career and student liaison. So you can see he hasn't really got much to do, which is why he's here tonight, giving us his take on computer security. Tom, it's over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to keep an eye on the room because I can see a couple of people joining in, but otherwise we can get going. So yeah, good evening. Let's just start with me. So as has already been introduced, thank you, John. I have been on the committee for a little while. You coaxed me into talking about this when we kind of first met early on. And yeah, I've been kind of looking for an excuse to, I wouldn't like to say get on my soapbox, but we might get that way depending on what happens. But yeah, relatively early career, which is kind of a novelty in its own right in terms of getting to meet lots of people and try different stuff. And as with that, I've had a bit of a range of different things that I've got involved in, which has started with central government stuff, looking a lot at kind of incident response, going out, pulling drives, that kind of thing, and saw a lot of how things can go really, really wrong in a security environment. And so ended up kind of going in and talking to people about their security. I've partly applied some of that and partly just kind of picking stuff up as I go along. I've kind of always had quite an interest in the kind of human factorsy side, thinking about how you can design a secure system such that it's kind of it's considering how the people involved are going to use it and what that means for the whole exercise of it actually being a secure system. I've kind of got pretty strong views on how you should be thinking about user experience, user-centered design stuff, and in a lot of cases, I think that's a key part of the whole exercise of doing security. Today, I'm going to be talking about particularly identity and access management, given that that's where I currently find myself in the cybersecurity space. I'm going to get the three-letter acronyms out of the way because they're almost certainly going to slip in at some point. And I'm not going to assume that everybody listening has got an IAM background, perhaps not, even if everybody listening has kind of got some view on cyber and kind of general information risk stuff. So digital identity, generally speaking, is kind of about how you actually identify a person accessing digital systems. And there's a bunch of IAM terminology, as always, in this space, three-letter acronyms. So if kind of any of these sorts of things come up around IAM, IGA, PAM, those sorts of things. But the main thing is that IAM as a concept is getting the right users, the right access for the right reasons. So starting with that basis, we're going to see what I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of the problems are I see in the kind of cybersecurity kind of comms space, what people are talking about, how people get buy-in for a cybersecurity project, and what I think you should do instead. So anybody who's kind of deeper into this space is going to notice that I'm omitting something here. There's kind of a bit of a pattern between these, but there's a bunch of reasons why you might start thinking about identity security in general. In a lot of cases for people, that means they've had an audit, whether that's internal or external, and there's some specific finding like, oh, people have got access to this thing that maybe they shouldn't do. There's been a lot of talk recently about things like changing regulatory environment, what that means for people securing systems. You might be in the worst case scenario, which is something's gone really badly wrong, and now you're kind of picking up the pieces. You're like, well, what could we have done to have not messed that up? And then we want to start thinking more about identity security. And partly, workplace has changed a lot. People used to much more regularly be on their premises and going straight into accessing stuff. And then the few people that weren't were probably doing stuff through VPNs. Increasingly, people are hitting stuff that's more internet facing. There's a lot more outward exposure, and then people are starting to think, right, well, what can I do to deal with that problem? The pattern, if you didn't already work it out, is that these are all quite reactive. There is a kind of immediate, okay, well, something's already happened, what can I try and do? Or I've noticed that there's problems, what can I try and do? And I think there's nothing wrong with that. You know, if someone comes along and you have an audit and they say there's a massive hole in your system, you should fix it. I'm not saying, oh, right, no, we're going to throw away all kind of security auditing. But you can probably imagine that you should probably have got to it a bit sooner than that. And not just from a risk perspective, but from other perspectives as well, which I'm going to put a pin in and come back to a little bit. The main kind of things that are missing if you come at it from the kind of purely I'm mitigating a risk perspective, which I think is, particularly given the audience, the sort of way in which you might think about this stuff, is that you're missing out on when should you manage a risk? When will be the right or wrong time? How much is it going to cost me? How likely is it even going to happen? What systems do I need to talk about? There's all sorts of kind of variables. And the very typical that a lot of people will have come across, all this security stuff's really expensive. What's it doing for me other than maybe there's some theoretical risk somewhere that I don't really understand. So why should I be spending money on that? What else can I get out of it? As I say, put an opinion in that. There's also kind of other related drivers for this more reactive stuff, increasingly in the people starting to insure against cybersecurity risk, increasingly hearing that, okay, well, I can't demonstrate that I've got a tool for managing my credentials, or I've had an audit finding and there was a problem. Am I really very insurable? So sometimes, yeah, you do get these answers and people are going to start trying to solve those in order to kind of be generally compliant. There's the kind of general challenges, as I touched on, for moving to cloud in terms of a lot more just generally internet-facing infrastructure. What can we do about that? In some ways, this is good. There's just like people will have a better understanding of risk in cyber kind of realm, so they're starting to be interested in thinking about identity security. Nothing wrong with that. The thing that I'm getting up on my soapbox about a little bit is the scary stats. Let's do some scary stats. I found all these very, very quickly. These are all 2024, more or less. There's all these kind of big, scary numbers, like 80% of cyber attacks used identity-based attack methods, which kind of sounds immediately really scary. And you might read that, or maybe you're on a board and your information security person comes along and says, well, look at all these stats, look at all the problems that there could be. And as I say, that might well be true, but in a lot of cases, like kind of scaring people into it isn't necessarily the right way of going about doing it. If you're sufficiently interested in where I actually lifted these from, then I don't know if we circulate slides, but I can grab links and things. Having said that, if you're going to go with the fear approach, which is pretty common, I'm sure most people have seen these kind of headlines that are a bit like the lines of those stats that I've just kind of tried out pretty quickly. So, you know, there's a lot of motivating by fear going on. First question is it actually effective? Well, maybe in the short term, if you go to your board and say, oh, well, there's actually these like massive chance that you're going to lose millions. And the big one is there's like big financial numbers attached to these about how many millions it's going to cost you if this happens. So it might be effective. They might kind of go, oh, right, I'm going to fix that. But it's a short-term fix, and you need to be a little bit careful about that, which is part of why I'm going to come on to that. In some cases, it's a little bit vague. There's the whole exercise of, am I just kind of giving people the unknown? It's quite hard to quantify that. So if you're actually going to try and convince people to spend money on this stuff, is it really working for you, given that you're kind of talking about, okay, well, in some future state, I might have this breach on this statistical chance, and it might cost me this much in this way. There's a lot of kind of vague and maybe and possibly going on there, and it's quite hard to convince people with just that alone. We're at the BCS. I should probably talk about ethics as well. given that's a big thing BCS like talking about at the moment, and it's an important thing to talk about. Is it really a good idea from the perspective of you being a IT or security practitioner for you to kind of go, whoa, it's really scary, you fix the thing, everything's really bad? And no, maybe you shouldn't. There's kind of more to it than that. There's not necessarily anything wrong with occasionally drawing attention to big stuff, but if you kind of like broken record always going, oh, it's really scary, you're on to the next thing, which is it sustainable? There's always kind of something to be scared of. There's always the next thing. There's always CVEs coming out. Okay, what's it going to be now? But there's some problems that come along with that. So why not scare your boss with stats? Do you want to be the person who turns up and is always the doomsayer? Maybe you do. It probably wouldn't be my suggestion. As I've already talked about, it's quite hard to quantify what this kind of unknown state is. I told you so isn't going to win you any friends. If something's already gone wrong, then you've kind of missed the boat there. So we need to be kind of pragmatic here and go, how else can we convince people that this is the right way of doing it? And partly, you kind of get this reputation, as sometimes security people do, of being the reason you can't do anything. Oh, there's these bloody security people, you're always saying, I can't have this app, and I can't have this app, and I can't use this in this way. There's the kind of just general stakeholder fatigue stuff. If everything's scary, then you reach a point where, like, yeah, maybe it's all scary, and maybe I can't do anything about that. Maybe I'm just going to kind of hope, and it'll be all right. But in reality, if sometimes it really will be that scary. This, you see like a 9.8 risk CVE come out, and it's like, oh, we need to patch every system, and you're that situation where, oh, it's log4j or something, and oh dear, every system in the universe is going to have a exposure to it. You've slightly burnt your capital. Everything's really scary all the time, because then when the actually really scary thing that keeps people up at night happens, is everyone really going to listen to you? How are you going to get across that urgency when you've been urgent for so long? Partly, there's a long-term question. I said, yeah, there's that kind of short-term, wow, we're going to fix this. But once you've dealt with that imminent problem, you're kind of going to run out of imminent problems at some point, or the risk's going to be a little lower. And then the question is, what's your long-term buy-in plan? This stuff requires kind of budget over the long term for you to actually maintain these sort of security programs. You've got tools maybe people are paying licenses for. You've got to justify why it is that you're doing this. And yeah, you can always keep saying it's because there's going to be a big scary cyber attack at some point, and that might be true, but there are other ways that you might want to go across it. And trust me, if you scare people with an immediate problem and they go with some kind of quick and dirty tactical solution just to bang it out and cover the risk, if you go into that eyes open and you know you're covering something specific and then you've secured the next stage of the funding and whatever, then fine. But a panic tactical solution is always going to be a problem. As the saying goes, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary solution. You kind of start off with that, okay, well, we're going to fix this now, and then 15 years later, you're still stuck with it. And I've certainly seen plenty of places that are still stuck with things that they put in many years ago to solve a temporary problem. The other thing as well is that if you walk up and you kind of scare your board with all of the scary stats and what's going to go wrong, you create a bit of a culture in your whole company of like scaring people gets you your way straight away, but actually scaring your employees isn't a really good idea, and that's a big part of it as well. I think one of those main things is impact on your employees. How bad can it get if you just scare everybody all the time? Well, first of all, they're not going to want to listen to you. That whole thing of maybe just like blocking people from doing what they want to do is going to disengage them. When you actually need to teach them stuff, which you're going to need to do at some point if you're going to get people to the point that they're not going to kind of click on phishing links or whatever, you need them to listen to you. You need to understand how you can engage with them, and just kind of being the doomsayer isn't going to manage that. Partly, If you don't even get that, what you might get is just like extreme caution. I've been told this is really scary. So I'm gonna just like not, I'm gonna be really, really cautious every time I try and do anything. And as a result of that, you get kind of productivity questions. Are people going to take a lot longer to start thinking about what they're going to do? And the thing you get with that as well is there's kind of a misalignment between how we evaluate if people are following security procedures and the kind of day-to-day stuff that we expect people to do. And I've absolutely caught myself before being slightly paranoid about an email that's probably actually a legitimate email, but you're never 100% sure. And then you spend all your time, even if you are a super security person, maybe you spend all your time like doing threat intelligence on your emails, essentially, which I have certainly fallen into in the past. At a previous place I've worked, in my first week of joining, I got an email that I thought looked like a phishing email. And I started going, wow, I got a phishing email, that's really weird. So I started looking up like domain whois stuff, because I'd done the threat intel going in incident response side. Okay, right, what's this about? So I amused myself, I spun up my laptop, got a VM, and I went, okay, well, let's see what this link is. Bang, you've clicked on our phishing. Oh, really? And I was like, right, okay. I knew what I was doing. I understand you don't want me to. Yes, fine. You want the security team to do that. You don't want me faffing about. I understand that, but I really did know what I was doing. And I sent a very sad email to an IT person who said, I understand, but please don't do that again. So yeah, I've learned to be slightly more careful of these things now. But anyway, the point of that anecdote really is we expect people to click links in emails. You might be expecting somebody to write to you. You get like Microsoft Teams, someone shared you a group, and this stuff all looks legitimate. You might even be expecting it, but it might not be unless you're pretty sure. So we start to people get nervous about stuff that's legitimate, and also the opposite. They get acclimatized to clicking links all the time because people send them links in emails. And then the one time it's actually genuinely some sophisticated phishing attack, it's really, really hard to teach people how to avoid that. So it needs considering, how do you build up a security culture rather than just kind of testing people on how they respond to this stuff. You can kind of get them all superficial compliance. Okay, well, I've told you that there's these rules to follow, so people will follow the exact rules, and then the threat landscape changes. It's not taken very long for like ChatGPT stuff to come out. I got it in a talk, talked about ChatGPT, we got there, and how long did that take? Not very long. And so a lot of this like fake stuff is getting a lot better. You get really convincing emails. There's quite convincing deepfake stuff now. If you just teach people, here's a set of rules, follow them, and not to think more broadly about what's trusted behavior, what isn't, the threat landscape changes, and you've got a lot of work to do very quickly to change people's perceptions and how they're going to deal with that next problem that's always going to come along. And also, you get shadow IT stuff. People just don't want to listen to you. It's really hard to create an environment in which people can never do anything you don't let them do, because then they just can't really do their job and it's too hard to get anything done. So you find yourself in some compromised land wherein you constrain the really privileged stuff, and maybe just day to day people can do a little bit of stuff, and then what they do is they ignore your processes and they ignore your policy, and you end up with what I've seen loads of times, which is, oh yeah, we've got 3 different apps that do that because the one that's there people don't really like, and it's hard to use, and maybe it's overly secure, and you are overly secure, slightly strange sentence, but perhaps. And then people just go and use something else, and if they can get away with it, they probably will, because most people are probably quite likely to evaluate that they know what they're talking about. So it's a tough one. As you can tell, breathe, I've done a lot of rambling there about problems that you get with kind of trying to scare people. So I'm going to put this through the lens of an IAM program in particular, because it's what I know the best. What other kind of value can you get for thinking about all these security controls and things like that that are not just wow, it's going to stop me from the next cyber attack. There is an alternative to giving loads of scary stats. One of the big things is onboarding. When someone joins a company, how many times have you had the experience where it takes weeks for you to get access to what you need access to? You turn up, someone says, okay, well, there's these distribution lists, you need these SharePoint drives, you need this equipment. And in a lot of cases, it's just, oh yeah, you have to send a support ticket for that. And oh yeah, that needs activating here. And oh, you need to go to this building and do this. And it can kind of take you weeks to get started. And from a purely kind of company culture perspective, it can be like, okay, well, I don't really feel like I'm kind of meant to be here yet. I've worked in places before, it's like I didn't get a pass for a few weeks. I ended up kind of knocking on the door and going, could you let me in, please? And it actually is kind of a bit demoralizing because you feel like you kind of shouldn't be there. So generally just being able to get to a point where you can do this stuff efficiently is actually quite nice for your employees, not only because it's more efficient, it gets them through the door, it gets them learning stuff quicker and it gets them doing stuff, but also just it's kind of just nicer to feel that you're meant to be there and it's all set up properly and you don't have to fight straight in the door with all the process. Because you get to the situation that I've already described where if you have to fight with the process all the time, people will do what they can to avoid your process. And they will do it quickly and they'll learn fast. And I've seen some considerable ingenuity. So a lot of the problems that come out of that is it line manager led completely? Is it you completely reliant on somebody close to the process to kind of just work it out and do the right sort of thing? You might be in a lot of cases, unless you've got a nice tool set that's designed for this, which you might well do. But moment to moment, until you've thought about, let's say, an identity security program, you're not going to have got that. So there's always going to be inconsistency in process if you've not got to that point yet, until you start getting into the more complex land of things like role-based access control, thinking about, okay, well, I've joined and I have this job, and it says that in my HR system, and that's been validated. Okay, well, what should that person have? Let's give them the right distribution list. Let's give them the right equipment. And the advantage of that is when they actually leave at some point, which they probably will at some point, you will find yourself actually knowing what you gave them in the first place and what needs to be taken away. A lot of this, there's a lot of opportunity for automation. There's a lot of, okay, well, somebody needs access to this thing. How easy can we make it to sign that off? Can we make sure that they're informed, they've got the right data to make that decision? An interesting question. If you have to sign off people's access to an application, how often do you decline that? What would be the criteria in which you would actually decline a request if you know who the employee is? A very diligent manager might think, oh, I wonder if they really should have access to that. But I'm not convinced out of the gate, without a good security training program and a good security culture and understanding all of the reasons why you might not want to do that someone might do that. Or maybe it's the sign off of someone who's like the product owner of the app and they kind of don't even know who that person is and they make a guess. So yeah, maybe the circumstance where you decline a request is never. And then really what you've created is an opportunity to point the blame at somebody when something bad happens, because you've got a nice big list of whose fault it was, but it's maybe not made you any more secure. Maybe a tiny little bit, but not as much as I would be aiming for myself. One of the common ones in this space in terms of the automation side is if I need, okay, well, I arrive and I need access to Teams and I need access to whatever my accounting software is, because that's what department I work in. Okay, well, how does that actually happen? Do you raise a support ticket and someone goes in and pokes at it and then they have to log into some admin account and then they do it, and then there's like a 3-day SLA on every single one of those, and then you realize you've forgotten something, and then suddenly it's taken 2 weeks and you've not got what you needed yet. Really, really easily done. So how much of that can you start to automate if you understand that there's a particular role that should have these particular things? Maybe you don't actually need someone to sign it off, because maybe you've essentially designed it based on you know who that person is, so you can give the right access. Another thing is, can they use and manage their own stuff to the extent that makes appropriate sense? If somebody's phone number changes, Is there a good way for them to tell you that? Or does it involve a support ticket? Does that change anything with their multi-factor authentication? Does that mean we need to think about the risk of that? There's all sorts of variables, but the more you can reduce the amount of kind of waiting for support tickets that is involved, the more you can start focusing your resource on, okay, well, what's the right way of threat modeling this? What's the right way of thinking about what the problems might actually be and how we can make this more seamless? And also, just if you've got somebody in support fixing this stuff, manual data entry introduces errors. People make mistakes, it happens, particularly with... There are all sorts of circumstances where you might be giving somebody who doesn't have a very good contextual understanding of your environment the decision to just kind of follow a rule set and say, okay, well, this person has this system, I need to go in and type these details in a box somewhere. Maybe it's free text and they just mistype it, and you end up with 20 versions of the words London office, depending on exactly how they've decided to put it in the box on that day. And then you start getting lost, because eventually you're going to decide you want something nice, you want some proper role-based access stuff, you come along and there is sales representative, sales rep, every single possible mistake, and you've got a big data cleaning job to do, and it's really painful. And then when you're trying to sell this to somebody, oh yeah, okay, well, hello boss, I want the money to be able to do this. You've actually made the problem so big, it's going to be really expensive. And then it's really, really hard to convince anybody that this is a good idea and we shouldn't just keep doing what we've always done. Partly, employee enablement's important. Getting rid of that security standing in the way of me doing anything problem. The more you can think about how the users are going to interact with your systems, the more you can think about how you can make it easy for them. And the easier you can make it for them, one, the more brain space they've got to actually think about if this is safe, if this is well considered. But also, it's just generally going to help your productivity in your company. And all of this is good stuff. Some of the specific examples: how easy is reviewing someone's access? Is it appropriately frequent? Are you basically constantly asking people to check again that everything's all right? If, let's say, you check every 6 months, but a campaign's 2 months long, maybe people are spending a third of the time thinking about this stuff, and then they kind of don't. Then they just go click, 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 click. Yeah, that's fine. And once again, you've created a tool for pointing the finger at somebody and not for making anything more secure. Let's talk of practices. There are ways in which you can do this well. I complained about stats. There's nothing wrong with stats. Stats are really good, particularly if you've got a board and you need to convince them to release some money so that you can get a tool and licenses and design it and implement it and think about all your different pieces that are all doing different stuff and all over your environment. Stats are really useful. The warning I would give is, are you grabbing the latest headline about what's really bad and what needs solving? Or are you using data about your environment in a way that's going to tell a good story? Why that stat in particular? So the nice examples of that are, we've got 20,000 support tickets that are password resets. How much does that cost in person hours? How much is it going to cost to automate that? How much more space are people going to have in the support team when other stuff happens? These are really nice stats, and you might not even have access to all that data, but it's a good place to start, starting to find where you might get this data from, because you can probably make good estimates, and a good faith attempt at what's even going on in our environment is a good way of starting to justify how you're going to start improving this stuff and what's going to be involved in getting to a state that is better than where you currently are. There's nothing wrong with doing something that's a bit better than current. You don't necessarily have to go, right, every single application in my entire environment needs putting onto this new system and everything's going to be great and we're going to fix all the problems, and it's been 5 years and you're still at it and you kind of don't know when you're going to finish and people are looking around a little bit concerned. Well, yeah, okay, work out what's the kind of time to value where you can solve the first problems that people are interested in. As I say, you don't have to completely do away with the immediate problems. you really shouldn't do away with the immediate problems. If someone's giving you an audit finding, there's probably a reason for it, fix it. But you don't have to like stop there, but you also don't have to do everything. You can find an appropriate balance, and that's a perfectly possible thing to do as well. But the overall thing is, if I'm giving you a stat, is it justifiable in the context? Is it unique to my context? Is it just a bit scary? If it's just a bit scary, it's probably not going to work. One of the things I've already touched on a little bit, doing okay, is that kind of risk thinking in terms of what's the long-term view where I can get people in the organization thinking more about security and safety and how they can avoid problems. I've already touched on phishing tests versus workplace norms. If people click links all the time, they're going to click links. That's not going to stop. So you probably need to think more about how you can protect them in other ways. There's all sorts of endpoint stuff. There's all sorts of things here. I'm not going to go deep into how you defend against phishing tests or actual phishing attempts in reality, but there's all sorts going on there. Whole talk in itself. The main thing I would just caution against is avoid swinging the consequences stick. You end up once again being the person who's stopping people from doing things. If you're just pointing the finger at people, it's not going to make you really more secure. And in fact, people might just not want to talk to you. People might be very cautious, slow down, not try to do what it is that they're trying to do. And you have all sorts of problems. Think about the user. User experience is an important part of this whole thing. The more empowered the user is to make good decisions within a constraint, they'll do that because they'll understand why you're making those decisions. The main thing is, if you make it easier to interact with all this stuff, people want to interact with the stuff. If your system for logging into your remote desktop is really nice and easy, and you click one button, it forwards all your credentials, it just works. You're going to do that. If the alternative is I have to write it down in a text document somewhere, and I have to remember where I put it, and I have to remember which one's which, and I have to copy it in. The insecure method's actually worse. And then people want to use the nice secure solution, and you get rid of a lot of that kind of shadow IT stuff. That's I think, the emerging space in terms of getting to a more secure environment. The easier you make it for the user, the more they want to work with you. So the takeaway there, I did weirdly well for time, is scaring people at first is probably going to work for a little while, and it might get you that immediate, we need to fix this audit finding, we need to fix this problem. But there's a lot of consequences to your culture if you keep doing that. The easier you make processes to follow, people want to do it, and ideally you make not following the process hard. That would be the ideal. You have both of those, and then you get a natural move towards a more secure environment. And so automation's getting easier. There's all sorts of tools. There's all sorts of clever data-driven stuff. I'll even say the words. There's even AI stuff that will start to make more cool decisions about, okay, well, I log into my tool and it's noticed that this behavior is unusual. Okay, well, let's go and look at what we can do about that. And then very slowly you build up. As I said, you don't have to fix everything all at once, but you can start to fix stuff, and overall, scaring people's not going to work. So yeah, thank you very much.
Tom. We take questions, Tom?
I'm happy to take questions. If somebody puts their hand up or just starts talking online, then hopefully we will hear you in the room, or from the room, but
one of the problems I find with all the working from home, we have remote identity, is the really big challenge at the moment. Two-factor verification, all that sort of stuff. But ultimately, how do you know that the person at the other end of the line is the person who you think it is?
Well, it depends on how sure you want to be, would be my starting point. There are levels of confidence that you can get to. There's a lot, there's all sorts of NIST standards and things about, oh, what level am I achieving? But fundamentally, if it's somebody's trying to access something really privileged, you probably really care that that's exactly who it is, and you do all sorts of metrics. You can see, has some impossible travel happened? Are they in London and then now they're in Edinburgh and it's been 15 minutes? Okay, well, they probably are. It's probably not the same person. Something's got a bit wrong there. Where do they normally access? How long do they spend on certain activities? Is this suddenly deviating from the norm? Banks do all this stuff a lot. It's like, okay, well, this person spends 25 seconds on this page, and then they spend 35 seconds on this page. And then suddenly it takes 2 seconds, 2 seconds, 2 seconds. You go, oh, nah, that doesn't seem quite right. So there's really, really clever stuff being done data-wise to try and do this. But to a certain point, you don't always need to be that sure. If someone is just like having a look at something that is relatively like low privilege data or something, okay, well, if it's the device it's usually on, it's probably right. It's probably not some unbelievably sophisticated attack in which I'm pretending to be exactly the right device fingerprint. Oh, and I've actually like somehow like cracked entirety of encryption. If somebody like breaks into something truly privileged, they're probably not going to burn it on your like standard read only, not very important data. They're probably going to burn it on a target that is not anybody in this room, because there's always kind of a bigger fish with this stuff. And yeah, okay, if your threat model is I'm a government intelligence agency, then okay, right. What you really, really might want to do is absolutely make sure you've seen that person in the room, you've watched them get their physical MFA device out, you've signed it up with them, you trust the person who was watching them, and you've created a whole web of possibility of, okay, well, if we trust this person, we've done this cryptographic thing, then okay, we're pretty sure that this is probably who they say it is, and we'll let it go. But how often are you that worried? Maybe you are sometimes. Does that answer the question? I think maybe I rambled around that, but...
No, I mean, but the big challenge is, these days, you've got machines talking to machines. So how do you identify the machine?
I mean, it very much, I mean, a lot of this like kind of like DevOpsy, I'm deploying code and it's actually just like some server somewhere deploying it on some other server somewhere. There's fingerprinting stuff you can do. We still probably trust cryptography at the moment. We've not reached the point of quantum where everything's collapsed. And if it has, as I say, you're not the first target, you're just not. So if that happens, maybe we all panic, but you don't have to be the first person to panic. Somebody will panic on your behalf sooner. So, yeah, okay. So overall, I still trust cryptography. So clever public-private key fingerprinting stuff is probably going to get you most of the way now, or most of the time.
Do we have anything online?
I don't see any hands. I will have a look if I can see the chat.
It's probably coming through the chat, yeah.
I don't see any questions in the chat, so you know, I'll be all. I have a question in the room, go on.
So you mentioned employees just kind of skirting the processes. How do you kind of square the fact that sometimes you need, like for developers, they might need to install tools on the machine to do their job properly? How do you square that with the fact that you don't necessarily want them? I'll use an example from my job. I know someone who, because we have 3 separate 2FA processes, because it's always been a temporary fix the last 15 years.
Yeah.
I know someone who wrote like a quick app to sync these codes to their desktop. So they've turned the 2FA into 1FA because it's just there.
Right.
And I mean, they're a developer. How are you going to kind of stop them just writing their own software to get around your difficult process?
To a certain point, their job is to write software you haven't inspected, which means if they run software you haven't inspected, you might be slightly malicious. Yeah. So yeah, it's a really good question. I'm not sure I know intuitively exactly what to do. The thing that the question comes down to, what level of confidence do I need to have and what level of trust do I have in that actor? If it's a developer who, every time they push code to our product, it's going through review, there's multiple environments you're deploying it to and doing testing on, then to a certain point, if your developer writes code, if you can't trust your developer not to be an insider threat, then your threat model runs deeper than perhaps you can do by just saying maybe they shouldn't. I'm not going to say that people who are developers shouldn't be able to poke around on their machine a little bit, because it's really handy. And if you stop them from like installing tools and doing basic stuff, then they are really, really going to struggle to do their job. And in really secure environments, people have that. Okay, like I have to put in a request for 2 weeks to wait for someone to go and check the software that I want to run on my machine. If you're a bank, maybe you have to do that because maybe you don't trust your employees so much around insider threat because the stakes are really, really high, because what if the global banking system all goes a bit wrong? So to a certain point, maybe you don't want your developers running code that they've just written. So that's a bit of a problem, but then, yeah, okay, you stop them from doing their job a little bit, but they're probably going to manage. And in fact, if you've constrained your environment really heavily, maybe you can genuinely stop them. But that's kind of a strong threat model where you're thinking, okay, well, I really, really need to prevent that. For the average developer, I kind of don't see why you shouldn't let them run stuff. If you're genuinely really, really worried your developer's going to write some zero-day exploit for your specific environment as an insider who you employed and went through the whole process of employing, yeah, I suppose they might do that. Then your next stage is, okay, well, how good are your backups? How well considered is your whole system environment? That would be my kind of overall answer to that.
You talked about statistics, and we know through research that take any population of people or users, 25% are totally honest, 25% are totally dishonest, 50% are only as honest as the system under which they work requires them to be. So you're going to always have a 25% threat.
Essentially, it depends on how bad how dangerous you think that threat is in your environment. If the threat is, if by dishonest we mean it won't follow my process, then there is a question about constraining the environment a little bit, not just letting people, for example, install software you don't recognize. But it depends how bad you think it's going to be. As I say, part of this whole thing is if you make it easier, even if someone is dishonest, why are they not going to do what's easier? There's no reason why I'm going to be actively. I've seen a question online. I'll get to it. There's no reason why, if I make it so easy to do the legitimate way, you're going to just not follow the process, because there's just one constant that I think I can probably put above people trying to be an insider threat is that people will be slightly lazy and they will do what you make easier for them. So that would probably be what I would start with. If you're desperately worried about insider threat, we're getting onto the same question. How much should I be worried? I'm going to say about the question that we've got online. For the benefit of the recording, the question from Andrew is, a good IAM system costs money. Enabling new starters to get all of their access on day one can also save lots of money. How do you quantify this as a business case to get an IAM system? Have you seen good examples of this? It's a really great question. I've certainly seen plenty of examples of quantifying the person hours involved in it. So as a starting point, if a new starter comes along and there's 5 support tickets involved in, they need a laptop, a mobile phone, they need access to the Microsoft stack, and they've got some specific app, and maybe they're a developer, so there's a bunch of stuff they need access to get started. Okay, well, how much time is involved in going in and doing that? You can make a good estimate. Partly, you know, if you've got really deep metrics, then to a certain point you don't need to be asking the question. So I'm going to go on the basis of maybe you haven't got really deep metrics. You need a good estimate. I'm not sure that most business cases are on the basis of, I know that this cost us 182,000 minutes, therefore it's going to be this much in thing. Maybe sometimes, but overall, a good estimate of, okay, well, that's this many, how many new starters have we got? How many tickets is that? How long-ish does it take to do one of these? And maybe you can work that out by going and talking to somebody in the help desk. Maybe do a bit of a shadowing exercise and you go and watch what they do. You see what the key problems are. And there's not actually loads of resource involved in you doing that little bit of analysis. And what you end up with is, okay, well, I've got the beginning of some nice statistics. And maybe that in itself is a good enough business case to gather a business case, essentially. You do the tiny little bit of legwork with a little bit of space you've got. You start off with, okay, well, this is what I think might be possible. And then you see what you can do to gather more metrics, and you start from there. I think to maybe address it slightly more directly in terms of what are some good examples of that, I think a lot of the time you can do this in a slightly less mathematical but still kind of rigorous way, and you can start with, right, well, what are our really key pain points here? Take a business analysis approach, which I suppose is what I would say given my background, but by all means, try and understand, well, what are the processes? What's wrong with them? If people have got pain points, okay, can we extrapolate that out? How often do we think that might happen given how many people are involved? And you start to build up that picture. And it's not necessarily going to be, here are your exact numbers, but it's a good place to start. And a good place to start will get you better as opposed to nothing at all. And I think most business-oriented people, when they see some nice automation systems start to go in place to fix the first couple of problems, are going to be able to extrapolate and start seeing where else it is you can go. And you can lead them through that story and take them to that point. I appreciate I've slightly skirted that question, but I hope that that's some interesting ideas to think about at the minimum.
If you're using role-based access, that must make it more simpler, because say this person is going to have this role, and therefore these are the assets they actually need to access.
Yeah, it does. It's often quite hard to start doing that. It depends on how good your data quality is, and your data quality might be quite poor. You might have some idea of some people that are involved in your system, and maybe some idea of what some key departments are. Okay, well, I'm in finance, so maybe I need the finance staff. I'm a developer, so maybe I need like all of my stack for pushing or for downloading my code and pushing my code. But you're not necessarily going to have really, really granular roles defined out the gate. Most places don't, because to a certain point, it's a place you get to. If you started and you went in with all the best practices in mind, then well done you. But I'm not sure I've ever seen it. So in reality, yeah, you kind of start with what you can start with. And role-based access control, I would say, is an endpoint. You get there, and cool, right, we understand all of our roles really well. But you can build your way up to that. You can start with, okay, well, what are the key apps and who needs to access those and what kind of jobs do they have? And you can build up a bit of an idea of how to do that. And then you scale it up. And at some point, maybe you really, really will get to understanding your entire business environment. But you know, as is kind of the running theme through this whole thing, yeah, it'd be great, and you'll get value out of doing that, and you'll get value out of starting to model roles, but you don't have to do all of it straight away.
Always found if I went down to IT and said, give me the access control list for application X, they'd list all the users who had access to application X, they'd always forget the IT people.
Yeah, well, the interesting question is, there's more than one way to have access to something. Are you just on an explicit list of people that's been put in a database? Or they're groups, who's in the groups, and you can kind of unwind a whole tree of access. And some of the tools now are starting to do more kind of deep analysis stuff, like, well, I've got this role, and this role means I'm in this group, and this group means I have this privilege, and this privilege means I've got this application. And by inspection, it's really hard to see that there's a whole web through there, but they're starting to get to a point where you can do that analysis, and you can start to say, okay, well, let's unwind the whole thing and work out who's my super admin and what can they see. And if somebody's your super admin, how careful are they with their credentials? Are they well considered? Should they even, just because you are the super admin, does one specific super admin account really need access to everything in the world? Is that really right? And how often does the CTO insist that they should be the super admin? So, you know, there are cultural problems here that you can start with. But yeah, but by all means, it's a complex problem.
I mean, touching on that, the CTO insisting that they're a super admin, how would you kind of go about convincing these C-suite people who are like kind of going in, well, my business, I should have everything, convincing them that, yeah, they may be in charge, but that doesn't actually, for security reasons, they shouldn't actually have access to this sort of thing?
Yeah, well, I think, and this is where being appropriately leaning on a little bit of the risk side is a good idea. Just to a certain point, it's not about you saying they shouldn't have access. There can always be some mechanism where they can get somebody in a room and they can show them, right? They literally probably don't need themselves to touch the toys. You know, sometimes maybe they want to, but it's not about them, it's about their identity, their accounts. And if they seriously believe that they will never, ever make any error ever, they're never going to leave a password somewhere, they're never going to be the person who clicks on an MFA prompt they shouldn't do, any of the potential things that go wrong. Yeah, okay, there's all sorts of, you can go deep down the level and you can try and defend against everything. And now if you use your MFA on Google, it shows a little number on your screen so that if you're getting prompt bombed, you kind of can't just click OK because you don't know the information on the other end. So there's clever stuff. People are always getting kind of through the arms race of how can we make things more secure. But if the CTO genuinely believes they will never make a single error, then you've probably got a long road ahead of you in your company culture to stop that. And so do what you can. But you know, make their account as convoluted as possible. Give them lots of additional factors they have to go through. That right? And then if they start arguing with that, then okay, we're getting a bit far down the road here. But fundamentally, it's about getting them to the point of understanding that it's not that you don't trust them. Of course you trust them. It's not about trust. It's about what the appropriate amount of access you need in that moment is. And this is why even in the average organization, your IT admin doesn't just have super admin on their personal account they use for reading their emails. They've probably got some escalation account, even if it's admin underscore their name and it's a separate account with a different password. It's a start. At least get them to do that so that they're not going to just be an attack vector. That would be the starting point.